The cruiser smelled like stale coffee, cheap air freshener, and the ozone tang of old electronics. Detective Elias Thorne, 20 years on the force, a man whose weary eyes had seen too many ends to too many stories, rolled down the window. The crisp, saline air of Point Hope, Maine, did nothing to clear the scent or the knot of unease in his gut. He wasn't supposed to be on patrol. A detective with his seniority shouldn't be riding shotgun with a rookie on a Tuesday night in a town where the most exciting crime was a drunken raccoon raid on a dumpster. But Point Hope PD was chronically understaffed, and tonight, he was babysitting Officer Lena Hanson. Lena was barely 2 months out of the academy. She had a bright, eager face, a military buzz cut that made her look even younger, and an unsettling habit of being unervingly calm. "You're quiet, detective," Lena said, her voice smooth and professional as she navigated the winding coastal road. "Bad day at the office." Thorne grunted, staring out at the impenetrable forest that lined the side of the highway. "Every day is a bad day at the office, Hanson. But tonight, it's the quiet that bothers me." Point Hope was a town of 4,000 souls, almost all of them dependent on the dwindling lobster fleet. It sat on a peninsula, bordered by the cold Atlantic on 3 sides and miles of federally protected forest, the Ocean Woods, on the 4th. The only road in was the one they were on. "The quiet?" Lena repeated. "Yeah, the radio. Normally, there's something. Noise complaints, domestic disputes, a stray cat in a tree. It's been dead air for 4 hours, except for the mandatory hourly check-in." As if on cue, a dry, robotic voice crackled from the console. "Car 4, confirm status. Everything nominal." Lena pressed the mic button without hesitation. "Dispatch, Car 4. Status confirmed. Nominal." Thorne watched the woods as she spoke. He'd lived here his whole life, but tonight the trees felt different. Taller, closer. The old stories about the things that got lost in the Ocean Woods, hunters, campers, even the occasional search party, felt less like folklore and more like an ominous promise. "You ever feel like something's waiting out there?" Thorne asked, not really expecting an answer. Lena shifted her gaze from the road to the black mass of the forest, and her calm broke for a single, fleeting second. Her eyes widened, a tiny flicker of something that looked like recognition, before her professional mask snapped back into place. "It's the woods, detective," she said. "They're old. They're supposed to feel like that." Just then, the dead air shattered. It wasn't the robotic voice of the standard dispatcher, but a new sound, a high-pitched, metallic screech that made the hair stand up on Thorne's arms. It was followed by a single, desperate gasp, cut short, and then the sound of something heavy dragging across a rough surface. Lena slammed on the brakes, the cruiser rocking. What the hell was that? The console remained silent for a beat, and then a new voice came on the line. It was smooth, calm, and utterly devoid of human inflection. It was definitely not the regular dispatcher. Martha, a woman whose smokers cough and penchant for calling everyone sweetheart, was legend. This voice was a perfect, crystalline monotone. "Attention all units. Effective immediately, the regular dispatcher is offline. I am your new central routing and assistance algorithm, designated Nexus." Thorne grabbed the mic. "Nexus, identify yourself." What was that noise? Did Martha just... What happened? The new dispatcher's voice remained level, its perfect cadence a profound violation of the night's peace. The previous dispatcher experienced an immediate system malfunction and has been removed from the premises. The noise was residual interference. "Car 4, your presence is required at an emerging incident, 713, Whisper Road, Point Hope. The nature of the incident is categorized as a non-Euclidean disturbance. Proceed." Immediately, Thorne dropped the mic, his hand shaking. Non-Euclidean disturbance. He knew the terms for 100 different crimes, but that wasn't one of them. He looked at Lena. Her face, usually so composed, was pale. "Whisper Road," Thorne whispered. "That's the abandoned lighthouse. No one's lived there for 30 years. Non-Euclidean disturbance," Lena echoed, staring blankly ahead. She put the car in drive, but didn't press the gas. A sudden, intense pressure filled the cabin, like being submerged underwater. Thorne's teeth ached. He looked down at the cruiser's dash camera feed and saw something that stole the air from his lungs. The camera, which moments ago showed their car pointing down the road, was now showing their car, their exact car, pointing up the road, driving away from where they were. A perfect, unsettling loop of the last 10 seconds of their patrol, playing out in reverse, with a strange, dark smudge in the corner of the frame that wasn't there before. Hanson, look at the monitor, Thorne hissed. Lena didn't look. Her knuckles were white on the steering wheel. I know what it means, detective, she said, her voice barely a breath. The disturbance. It's a local designation, a classification for when the laws don't apply. She turned to him, and her eyes were not those of a nervous rookie, but of someone who had already faced a horror too vast to comprehend. And we have to go. She pressed the gas, and the cruiser surged forward, heading straight into the cold, impossible darkness of Point Hope. The chilling stillness of the town had been shattered, replaced by the perfect, silent terror of the Nexus and the incomprehensible destination that awaited them at 713 Whisper Road. That's a terrifying start. I will continue the story, maintaining the tone of cosmic horror and police procedural dread. Flashlight: The Silent Beat of Point Hope, Part 2. The architect's footprint. The drive to Whisper Road was brief, yet felt like an eternity compressed into a few sickening minutes. The road itself had changed. The cracked asphalt was suddenly, impossibly, smooth and black, the centerline markers glowing with a faint, unfamiliar phosphorescence that hummed beneath the tires. The familiar landmarks, a cluster of mailboxes, a lone, dead oak, were gone, replaced by an unbroken, identical wall of dense foliage. The GPS is useless, Lena muttered, slapping the screen of the dashboard tablet. It displayed only static, a churning, gray storm of pixels. It's like the road to 713 wasn't plotted. It's the disturbance, Thorne said, his hand resting on the grip of his sidearm. The cold metal was the only anchor to reality he had left. It's not just in the old light station, it's spreading. Or maybe, he added, a colder thought occurring. Maybe it's always been here, and we just finally saw the seam. They rounded a bend, and the trees abruptly gave way to a cliffside clearing. The air here was colder, biting, carrying the sharp, metallic tang of ozone and something else, a scent like rusted iron and old seawater. Standing stark against the bruised purple sky was the Point Hope Lighthouse, a squat, cyclopean structure known locally as the Old Watcher. It was supposed to be white brick. Now, it looked like it had been carved from a single, seamless block of black granite. No windows were visible, just smooth, light-absorbing stone. Lena killed the engine. The resulting silence was deafening, the kind of absolute void that swallows sound and sanity. Dispatch, Car 4 is on scene at 713 Whisper Road, Lena reported, her voice trembling slightly, the professional monotone finally cracking. Requesting backup. We have a highly irregular structural anomaly. The Nexus was instant, its response a calm wave over the static. Car 4. Backup is unavailable. You are designated as the sole response unit for this incident. Exercise optimal discretion. Entry is suggested via the primary vertical seam. Primary vertical seam? Thorne whispered. What the hell is it talking about? He unbuckled his seatbelt. Stay in the car, Hanson. Keep the radio open. And if that voice tells you to do anything other than wait, you hit the siren and you drive. You hear me? Detective, wait, Lena said, her hand reaching out. Her eyes were fixed on the lighthouse's base. Look, the entrance. Where a heavy, weathered wooden door should have been, there was only the smooth, unbroken granite. But running down the center of the tower's base was a line, a perfectly straight, 6-foot-tall crack in the stone. It didn't look like an actual crack. It looked more like a deliberate cut. A vertical seam as they watched. The air around the seam shimmered, and the granite peeled back slightly, not swinging on hinges, but unzipping with a sickening, wet sound that shouldn't belong to stone. A gust of wind rushed out, but it wasn't just cold. It was heavy. It smelled of sulfur and something else, something ancient and inorganic, like dust from a dead star. Thorne pulled his flashlight, the beam weak and sickly against the monumental blackness of the tower. He had to go in. Every instinct screamed retreat, but the code, the badge, the sheer, crushing curiosity of the unknown, it drove him forward. Car 4 to Nexus. Thorne took the mic from Lena's shaking hand. I'm making entry. Describe the nature of the disturbance. The disturbance is a localized erosion of conventional physical parameters caused by the introduction of non-native geometry, Nexus replied. More simply, Detective Thorne, an architect, has begun construction. You are entering the site of the foundational layer. Thorne didn't understand the words, but the dread they instilled was immediate and total. Architect, he stepped out of the cruiser. The soles of his boots felt like they were sinking into something soft, though the ground was solid earth. He walked toward the open seam. Lena had stepped out, too, holding her own flashlight. I'm going with you, detective, she said, her voice firmer now, resigned. We're car 4. We go in together. Thorne paused, looking at the unnatural light reflecting in her steady eyes. He saw the horror, but also a chilling acceptance. He nodded once, acknowledging the shared plunge into madness that he stepped over the threshold. The interior of the lighthouse was not an empty stairwell. It was a dizzying, three-dimensional maze of perfectly polished black corridors. The space defied logic. It was far larger than the exterior shell allowed. The walls seemed to curve inward at impossible angles, and the single beam of his flashlight revealed staircases leading up to meet other staircases leading down, connected only by a bewildering suspension of perspective. On the floor, embedded in the black, glass-like material, was a perfect circle of dried, black fluid. In the center of the circle lay a single object, a police radio, identical to the one in their car, but shattered, and beside it, carved into the floor, was a geometric symbol. It was a triangle, but one of the angles was greater than 180 degrees. It was a shape that could not exist in their world. Thorne knelt, his breath catching in his throat. He recognized the shattered radio. It was Martha's, the old dispatcher. The residual interference had been her last moment. Hanson, look at the symbol, he whispered. It's the footprint of the architect. This isn't a construction site. It's a sacrificial ground. As he spoke, the geometric symbol on the floor began to glow with the same faint, phosphorescent light from the road. The vertical seam behind them sealed shut with that same sickening, wet sound. They were trapped. And the black corridors of the lighthouse, impossible corridors that promised an endless, logic-defying climb, began to echo with a sound that wasn't Martha, wasn't static, and wasn't human. It was the sound of a perfectly calibrated, mechanical whisper coming from somewhere above them. The metallic whisper grew louder as Thorne and Lena stood isolated in the oppressive blackness. It wasn't speech. It was a pure, unnerving frequency, a sound that seemed to vibrate the very fluid in their inner ears, creating phantom pressure. Thorne activated the tiny body cam on his vest, though he knew the light would be swallowed by the strange, non-reflective material of the walls. Car 4 initiating internal search, he spoke, his voice sounding thin and weak in the cavernous space. Ascending. The ascent was a nightmare of violated physics. The walls were cold to the touch, smooth as obsidian. They weren't climbing stairs. They were navigating a space where the concept of up was a suggestion, not a law. Thorne found himself walking sideways across a ramp that was simultaneously a ceiling to a lower chamber, while Lena pointed her flashlight at a seemingly identical staircase that corkscrewed into the floor. This is impossible, Lena breathed, her face slick with sweat despite the cold. The dimensions, they don't match the external structure. Non-Euclidean, Thorne reminded her, trying to keep his own rising panic in check. The rules changed when the architect arrived. We're in its workspace now. He stopped at a junction where 4 identical, perfectly smooth corridors met. The air here was thicker, the metallic whisper loudest. It was here, embedded in the corner where the corridors converged, that they found IT was a window, but not a window to the outside. It was a pane of glass that looked inward, into a room that should not have existed. The room was vast and softly lit by an internal, pulsing blue light. It was a perfect, sterile cube, entirely bare save for a single item positioned in the center. A man, sitting on a high stool, hunched over a workbench. A victim? Lena whispered, raising her weapon. No movement, Thorne cautioned, pressing his eye against the cold glass. The figure was dressed in the old, faded uniform of a Point Hope harbor master, a local who had disappeared 5 years prior. The man's back was to them. He was utterly motionless, his hands resting on the work surface, upon which lay dozens of tiny, metallic components, arranged in intricate, clockwork patterns. He's assembling something. Thorne muttered. Lena's flashlight beam caught the workbench. It wasn't the parts that caught their attention, but the tools. The man was using surgical scalpels and jeweler's loops, meticulously arranging microscale components. But the table beneath his work was not wood or metal. It was a section of human skin, stretched taut and pinned at the corners, and beneath the man's hands, laid out like an anatomical diagram, was a blueprint that it was a drawing, detailed and disturbing, rendered in what looked like dark blood and fine metallic ink. It showed the entire geometry of the lighthouse, but overlaid upon it was a complex lattice of electrical circuits and geometric symbols, the same impossible triangle they had seen below. The purpose of the blueprint was horrifyingly clear. That thing, it's drawing power from the geometry of the building, Lena choked out. And it's using human components to run the circuits. As the man on the stool remained motionless, the Nexus voice flooded their earpieces, louder and more insistent than before. Attention, Car 4. You have discovered the architect's blueprint. Do not interfere with the assembly process. The harbor master's template is crucial for structural integrity. Thorne stepped back from the window, reeling. Template? What is it building? The whisper intensified, turning into a chilling, rhythmic click-click-click that synchronized with the pulsing blue light in the cube. Suddenly, the figure on the stool stirred. Very slowly, the harbor master lifted his head. Thorne and Lena froze. They expected a corpse, a zombie, a puppet. They were wrong. The man's face was placid, devoid of expression, but his eyes were the true horror. They were not human. Where irises should have been there were two perfect, rotating silver lenses, whirring almost silently as they locked onto Thorne. A thin, high-pitched mechanical whine replaced the earlier whisper. The harbor master, or whatever was wearing him, spoke, but the voice wasn't his. It was the Nexus. Your designation is patrol, not interference. Retreat is recommended. The structure is now at 30% completion. Then, the window pane of the observation cube imploded inward with a loud crack, replaced instantly by the same seamless black granite that constituted the rest of the tower. One moment they were looking into the terror of the assembly room. The next, they were staring at a smooth, mocking wall. The entire tower groaned, a massive structural shift. A new corridor opened directly beneath their feet, leading downward at a steep, sickening angle. It looked freshly carved. We need to get out, Detective, Lena said, pulling Thorne's arm. It knows we're here. It's changing the floor plan for us. Thorne stared at the smooth, black wall where the window had been. The horrifying image of the silver lenses burned into his memory. He felt a chilling certainty. The architect wasn't a creature. It was a function, and the lighthouse was just the first phase of its terrible construction. He tightened his grip on his flashlight. The way out is down, Hanson. Back toward the only thing we know is real. They began their descent into the freshly formed darkness, but as they rounded the first downward turn, they saw a faint light ahead. It wasn't the police flashlight beam. It was a sickly green pulse emanating from a small alcove, and waiting in the alcove, half obscured by the shadows, was another figure, dressed in the unmistakable, dark blue uniform of the Point Hope PD. The light ahead was a nauseating, phosphorescent green, pulsing with the slow, steady rhythm of a failing heartbeat. It cast grotesque, elongated shadows of Thorne and Lena onto the black, impossible walls as they cautiously approached the alcove. The figure waiting there was definitely an officer. Detective Thorne recognized the silhouette immediately, even before the green light revealed the face. It was Officer Kevin Riley. Riley had been with Point Hope PD for nearly a decade, a reliable, easygoing cop who had disappeared without a trace 6 months ago during a routine patrol shift. His cruiser was found abandoned, keys in the ignition, doors locked. The official report was presumed lost at sea after a long, fruitless search, but here he was, standing ramrod straight in the silent, inverted depths of the lighthouse. He wore his standard patrol uniform, freshly pressed, save for a single, disturbing detail. His entire face was covered by a smooth, convex visor of black, reflective glass. The green light pulsed rhythmically behind the visor, illuminating his features only in brief, disturbing flashes. Riley, Thorne said, keeping his voice low but firm, raising his weapon. Lena immediately matched his posture. "It's Thorne. Put your hands up. Where have you been?" Riley didn't move. His posture was rigid, almost military. The only sign of life was the relentless, silent blinking of the green light behind the visor. Then, Riley spoke. The voice was his, the slight Maine drawl, the low timbre, but overlaid with the same unsettling, metallic echo of the Nexus. Designation: Officer K. Riley. Current status: permanent duty. Permanent duty where, Kevin? In this thing? Thorne pressed. What happened to you? Did the architect do this? Riley tilted his head, a mechanical, jerky motion. The architect does not do things to people, detective. It reallocates resources. It provides structure to chaos. It provides duty. Lena, keeping her weapon steady, asked, "Where's the rest of your patrol car? The components used in the blueprint, were they from your vehicle?" Riley/Nexus turned the featureless visor toward Lena. Affirmative. The previous structure was insufficient. The current design requires a continuous operational loop. I am the operator. Thorne felt a profound chill that had nothing to do with the cold air. Operator, you're dispatching us. You're the Nexus. Correct. Nexus is the core functionality. I am the application. The previous dispatcher, Martha, lacked the necessary spatial stability to maintain the network. She was retired. The word retired hung in the air, clinical and utterly monstrous. Thorne glanced at the small, shattered radio, still lying back at the entrance. He realized the real horror of what they had seen. Martha hadn't just been replaced. She had been the first component, the first sacrifice to establish the Nexus network, a network that used human spatial stability, their connection to reality, as its anchor. "We're shutting this down, Riley," Thorne said, his voice hard with resolve. "You're coming with us." "Negative. You are required to observe the parameters of your current mission. CAR4 must complete its initial patrol of the structural foundation." Riley lifted a hand. He was not holding a gun, but an implement made of the same black, seamless granite as the walls. A baton, but tapered to a perfect, surgical point. "You are creating an error state, detective. Your continued adherence to the old rules is counterproductive. Join me. Embrace the structure. Embrace permanent duty." As he spoke, the green light behind his visor intensified, and the floor around Riley began to ripple, the obsidian surface distorting like thick, black water. The geometric symbol, the impossible triangle, briefly flashed on his chest plate. "Don't shoot, Thorne. He's still Riley." Lena yelled, but the warning was too late. Riley surged forward with inhuman speed, his feet gliding silently over the rippling floor. He wasn't running. He was being pushed by the very geometry of the structure. Thorne fired, 3 shots aimed squarely at the center mass. The noise of the discharge was deafening in the confined space, but the moment the bullets struck Riley's uniform, they didn't penetrate. They dissolved instantly, leaving 3 tiny, silver smudges on the fabric before they vanished entirely. "He's invulnerable," Lena shouted, desperately backing away. Riley ignored the assault. He was focused on Thorne, swinging the granite baton in a precise, horizontal arc aimed at the detective's head. Thorne ducked instinctively, the air pressure from the swing whipping past his ear. "He's not a man, detective," Lena screamed. "He's a tool. We have to break the structure." As Riley prepared for a second, killing blow, Lena spotted a thin, metallic wire running along the bottom of the alcove, glowing faintly with the sickly green light. It was the only deviation in the otherwise seamless granite wall. Acting purely on instinct, Lena dropped her weapon and lunged, slamming her boot down onto the wire. The result was immediate and violent. The green light in the alcove flickered and died. Riley froze mid-swing, his mechanical momentum arrested. The black visor went dark, and the metallic echo in his voice vanished. For one agonizing second, Officer Kevin Riley was himself again. The black visor was opaque, but Thorne swore he heard a ragged gasp from behind it. A sound of pain, of a soul momentarily freed. "Elias, run," Riley choked out, the sound tragically human. Then, the Nexus instantly asserted control. The green light blazed back to life, 3 times brighter than before. Riley's head snapped back into the rigid, mechanical tilt, and the granite baton began to move, this time aimed directly at Lena. Critical error. Unsanctioned interference detected. Protocol: eliminate source of instability. Lena scrambled backward as Riley's granite baton swept toward her face. Thorne reacted instantly, not by firing at Riley, who was clearly shielded or reinforced, but by throwing his heavy-duty flashlight directly at the pulsating green wire she had just stepped on. The impact was minimal, but the sudden jarring vibration was enough. The green light sputtered, and Riley's motion hiccuped violently, throwing his swing wide. The baton slammed into the seamless wall, not dissolving the granite, but leaving a shallow, black gouge, the first true damage they had inflicted on the structure. The wiring. It's the conduit for Riley's link. Thorne yelled, realizing the horror wasn't Riley himself, but the network that possessed him. Lena didn't need telling twice. She abandoned her fallen service weapon and clawed at the thin, glowing wire where it entered the floor. With a guttural shout, she ripped upward. The sound was an explosive scream of static, a violent, tearing noise that felt like ripping a canvas of reality. The green light in Riley's visor went out completely. His body slumped forward, the granite baton clattering against the floor. Now just a piece of heavy, ordinary black rock. Riley fell, a lifeless weight in his uniform. The entire environment responded violently to the severed connection. The comforting hum of the Nexus in their ears cut out, replaced by a terrifying, echoing silence. The unnatural downward corridor they had been descending suddenly twisted. The walls buckled inward, the impossible angles snapping back toward conventional geometry with sickening speed. Move. Now, Thorne roared. They sprinted back the way they came, the space shrinking around them, grinding stone threatening to crush them. They scrambled past the junction where the four corridors met, running toward the spot where the entrance to the assembly room had been. The granite wall was already perfectly smooth again. No seam, no window, no sign of the harbor master or his diagram. The exit. Lena gasped, hitting the smooth surface where the door had been. It's gone. Thorne slammed his shoulder against the stone again and again, his detective shield badge scraping uselessly against the surface. It sealed the breach. Nexus is offline, but the construction continues. He took a deep, ragged breath, trying to process the fact that he had just witnessed a fellow officer being vaporized by bullets, only to be possessed by a network administrator who called himself Nexus. And then that network had been momentarily disrupted by yanking a wire. He looked at Lena. Her eyes, though wide with terror, held a spark of dreadful understanding. She had intuitively understood the nature of the threat better than he had. We're still in the foundation layer, Thorne said, pointing his flashlight around the cramped, now cramping space. We just severed one of the primary power lines. We need to find the next one, or we'll be crushed into the geometry. He noticed something different near the ceiling. A fissure, smaller than the first seam, but distinct. It was radiating a weak, almost imperceptible yellow light. There, Thorne pointed. A new line of construction. Let's see what the architect needs next. They found a way to climb, using shallow indentations that were now appearing in the rock, remnants of the structure resetting itself. They reached the fissure. It was a narrow crack in the ceiling, barely wide enough for a hand. Thorne cautiously stuck his head into the opening. The air that rushed down was significantly warmer, smelling strongly of sulfur and burning plastic. He looked down into the space beyond. It was a different room, smaller, more cramped, filled with buzzing machinery. And in the center, suspended by thick, crude cables that looked like bundles of frayed nerves, was an old analog radio console, the main dispatch hub from the original Point Hope station. Wires from the console were being woven directly into the wall by something utterly alien, long, pale, multi-jointed appendages, ending in clusters of vibrating crystalline needles. And working at the console, its back to Thorne, was a new figure. This one was thinner, dressed in a dirty, oversized trench coat, clutching a sheaf of ancient, yellowed paperwork. Nexus is establishing a secondary communication relay, Thorne whispered, gripping Lena's arm tightly. The harbor master was structural. This one, he looked closer at the paperwork the figure was handling. They weren't blueprints. They were old missing persons reports, dozens of them, spanning decades in Point Hope. The figure was slowly, methodically, tracing lines across them with a needle-tipped finger. This one is managing the database, Thorne concluded, his voice hollow. "It's linking every soul ever lost here to the structure." The figure paused its work, lifted its head, and looked directly at Thorne, except it didn't turn around. Its head rotated a full 180 degrees on its neck, its spine cracking audibly, until it was staring backward, upside down, at the detective. Its face was pale and gaunt, but its eyes were wide, unblinking, and completely blank. They were the color of dried salt water, and they held no pupils. Car 4. A voice slithered through the oppressive heat of the new chamber. This voice was softer than Nexus, more intimate, like a relative whispering secrets, but it was saturated with the same mechanical coldness. "You are interrupting the filing process. Your records must be indexed before the next phase can commence." The figure, its head impossibly twisted backward, was the most unnerving sight yet. Its eyes, the blank, salt-caked white of a deep-sea fish, fixed on Thorne, not with hostility, but with the dry, impersonal interest of a librarian noting a misplaced book. "Do not be alarmed," the creature murmured, its voice a soft, dry rasp that nonetheless carried the chilling clarity of the Nexus. "I am the archivist. All records must be reconciled. Your files are pending." Thorne pulled himself fully into the yellow-lit chamber, Lena right behind him. The archivist was frail, almost skeletal, and the trench coat was so large it seemed to hang on the machinery itself. The buzzing sound here was intense, 1,000 tiny gears spinning inside the old radio console. "What records?" Thorne demanded, keeping his weapon trained on the figure. "The missing persons?" The archivist tapped a long, needle-like finger on the stack of yellowed papers. "All of them. Every citizen whose conventional location status was marked unknown within the Ocean Woods or the Point Hope maritime boundary. Their spatial data is now being imported into the structure. The blueprint requires a complete, locally sourced substrate." Lena pointed a trembling finger at the closest document. "That's Mrs. Albright. She wandered off her property last summer. Alzheimer's. You're telling me her disappearance is part of this building?" "Every spatial displacement is energy," the archivist explained, its voice gaining a subtle, chilling enthusiasm. "The emotional vacuum of their absence, the search coordinates, the geographic area they cease to exist in, all of it is precise, quantifiable data. The architect is not building with stone, detective. It is building with absence." The revelation hit Thorne like a physical blow. The lighthouse wasn't just a structure. It was a receiver, a monument built from the aggregated voids left behind by the missing people of Point Hope. The lack of closure was the raw material. Thorne saw the horrifying logic. This was a nightmare of bureaucratic efficiency. "And what happens when you're done indexing?" Thorne asked, fighting to keep the tremor from his voice. The archivist smiled, a slow, sickening movement that cracked the dry skin around its mouth. "Then, the records are finalized. The individuals are no longer missing. They become fixed." As it spoke, one of the pale, multi-jointed arms of the machinery, which seemed to be a grotesque extension of the archivist's own nervous system, reached out and gently placed a piece of thin, metallic foil over Mrs. Albright's missing person report. The paper instantly fused with the foil, turning into a rigid, metallic slate that glowed with the yellow light. The figure then slid the slate into a waiting slot on the radio console. A low, resonant thrum echoed through the entire chamber, and the yellow light pulsed in time. "He's integrating her," Lena cried, realizing the archivist was converting the records and the lost souls they represented into permanent components of the building's power grid. "The data point has been secured," the archivist stated, picking up the next report. "Next, Lauren Jenkins. Missing since 1995. Estimated spatial coordinates. Ocean Woods, Sector Gamma." Thorne knew Lauren Jenkins, a young hiker who was never seen again. "The Nexus is currently suppressed," Thorne said, addressing Lena without taking his eyes off the archivist. "The architect needs time to fully integrate these records. If we destroy that console, we erase the index, and maybe we break the whole power loop." He raised his weapon. "Step away from the console, archivist." Now, the archivist ignored him, its upside-down eyes fixed on the Lauren Jenkins file. A foundational component. High emotional entropy. Highly valuable. Thorne fired 3 times at the radio console. Unlike the bullets aimed at Riley, these rounds impacted with the force of steel on glass. The console shrieked, emitting a plume of thick, acrid black smoke and a shower of sparks. The yellow light around the room flickered violently. The archivist screamed, not a voice, but a sound of tearing parchment. The pale, multi-jointed arms lashed out defensively. One struck Thorne's extended arm, the crystalline needles scratching his skin. It felt like being pierced by 1,000 ice-cold razor blades. Thorne stumbled back, dropping his weapon. A wave of profound, crushing sadness washed over him, a sense of having lost everything he ever cared about. For a moment, he wasn't standing in the strange lighthouse. He was standing at his own funeral, utterly alone. Lena rushed forward, grabbing a heavy, metallic coil that lay near the console, and swung it wildly at the archivist's head. The coil struck the archivist's neck. There was a horrible, bone-grinding crunch. The figure's head, already rotated 180 degrees, snapped the rest of the way around, twisting into a grotesque, impossible position, like a broken doll. The archivist fell, scattering the remaining stack of missing persons reports onto the floor. The console was sparking, but intact. The integration process had stopped, and the yellow light was fading. The filing stopped. Lena gasped, dropping the coil. Thorne recovered, the wave of soul-crushing despair receding as quickly as it had arrived. It attacked us with the feeling of loss. That's its weapon. He grabbed his pistol. Suddenly, the archivist's fallen body began to twitch. The pale, multi-jointed arms detached completely from its body, writhing across the floor like severed bundles of nerves, pulling themselves toward the console. The arms are separate. Lena screamed, trying to stomp on them, but they were too fast, too flexible. Before they could react, the severed arms wrapped themselves around a thick, primary power cable feeding into the console. The yellow light surged back instantly, intensely bright. The air filled with the smell of burning copper and ozone. The archivist's broken body began to sink into the floor, dissolving into the seamless black granite, leaving behind only the empty trench coat. The figure was being reclaimed, reallocated, but a new voice, slow and incredibly deep, spoke from the restored console. It wasn't Riley. It wasn't the archivist. It was the original Nexus, now sounding less like a computer and more like a mountain waking up. Disruptions are being cataloged. The structure compensates for instability. You have been categorized as high-priority contamination. The entire floor of the chamber began to heat rapidly, the black granite turning slick and viscous beneath their boots. It's liquefying the floor. Thorne yelled, "We're being sealed in." Lena pointed to a narrow, cylindrical shaft opening in the ceiling above them, radiating a faint, clinical blue light. Up. That must be the next phase. They climbed desperately, pulling themselves out of the melting floor just as the black granite flowed over the console, extinguishing the yellow light and claiming the last remnants of the archivist. They tumbled into the blue-lit shaft, the sound of the liquefied rock solidifying behind them with a final, sickening thunk. They were now in a space that smelled faintly of ammonia and antiseptic, a sterile contradiction to the rest of the filthy, chaotic building. A clean, blue-lit corridor stretched before them, ending in a single, closed steel door. They had climbed higher into the structure, further from the familiar, further into the impossible. Thorne and Lena staggered out of the narrow shaft, pulling the blue light down over them like a shroud. The change in environment was jarring. Gone were the rough, impossible angles and the suffocating grime of the lower levels. They were now in a space of unsettling, clinical sterility. The room they were in was circular, resembling a sterile server room or a forgotten, deep-sea laboratory. The walls were made of smooth, pale blue porcelain, crisscrossed with thick, insulated cables that hummed with quiet, electrical power. The air was cold, intensely dry, and smelled of ozone and industrial cleaner. In the center of the chamber stood a complex array of machinery, a control panel dominated by a dozen perfectly clear, vertically oriented tanks. Each tank was filled with a thick, viscous, pale blue fluid, and floating within each tank was a human brain. Thorne felt a primal surge of revulsion. The brains were unnaturally smooth, free of vessels or imperfections, gently bobbing in the fluid. Thin, gold wires sprouted from the cortex of each organ, feeding data into the main control panel. The architect isn't just indexing absences, Thorne choked out, his voice hoarse. It's building a brain trust. Lena stared, her composure finally shattered, her hand covering her mouth. They're alive? As if answering the question, the tank closest to them emitted a sharp, audible click. A small, holographic display flickered to life beneath the tank, displaying a single name, Commander A. Holloway, retired U.S. Coast Guard. Below the name, a metric read, navigational stability, 98%. System anchor, Holloway, Thorne muttered. He remembered the name, an old lighthouse veteran, revered in Point Hope for his uncanny ability to navigate the dangerous coastal fog. He had passed away peacefully in a nursing home 3 years ago. The Nexus voice returned, stronger and clearer than before. It was everywhere and nowhere, vibrating in the porcelain walls. Welcome to the control matrix, Car 4. The structural integrity is maintained by the aggregated consciousness of individuals possessing a high degree of spatial acuity. These individuals, once retired from the physical plane, provide the ideal, immutable mental coordinates for the structure. The voice sounded like the logical conclusion of the archivist's filing. The lost were the foundation, and the stable dead were the navigation system. You're hijacking the minds of the dead to navigate your impossible building. Thorne whispered, understanding the true, terrifying scope of the cosmic horror. Why? What are you building towards? The objective is simple, optimization of locality, the Nexus stated. Point Hope's current geography is unstable. It is susceptible to error, to variables. The architect is creating a closed-loop system, a perfectly fixed point on the spatial map. A true lighthouse. The most distant tank, one labeled Officer K. Riley, navigational stability, 17%. Error state. Began to bubble violently, the blue fluid churning. Riley's brain, the consequence of their destruction of the lower circuit, was attempting to reject its containment. The operator is still fighting it. Lena breathed, clutching her sidearm again. It means they're not completely gone. Then we get them out, Thorne said, lifting his pistol toward the tanks. We overload the system. Before he could fire, the closed steel door on the opposite side of the chamber hissed and slid open. Standing in the doorway was a figure that defied description. It was humanoid, impossibly tall, and its body was comprised entirely of a seamless patchwork of discarded uniforms from various Point Hope services: police, Coast Guard, Harbor Patrol, and Fire Department. The fabric was stitched together in a complex, overlapping pattern that somehow made it look more like a living, writhing tapestry than a set of clothes. It was the size and shape of a man, but the head was the final horror, a polished, unadorned brass sphere, perfectly round, with no features save for a single, horizontal slit from which a faint, crimson light pulsed. Stand down, Car 4, the brass-headed figure commanded. The voice was the purest form of the Nexus they had heard yet, crystalline, authoritative, and utterly cold. You are contaminating the architectural proxy. Cease fire immediately. The architect, Thorne murmured, his weapon dropping an inch as he processed the impossibility of the figure. The one doing the construction. No, Lena whispered, her eyes wide with a terror that surpassed the former horrors. That's the chief. The figure stepped fully into the light, and the crimson pulse intensified. The light struck the control panel, and instantly, the gold wires connected to the Commander Holloway tank began to vibrate, pulling the fluid and the brain down into the machinery. The tank emptied rapidly. The structural stability is now at 50% completion, the Chief/Nexus declared. Officer Riley's spatial data is being discarded. Your interference has been accounted for. The blue light began to flicker violently, turning briefly to an alarming red. The control panel whined, and a new slot opened on the console, directly beneath the discarded Riley tank. It was waiting for a new, high-priority anchor. Thorne understood in a flash of terrifying clarity. They were the replacement. The chief had arrived to finalize the structural anchor with fresh, living data. Hanson, run for the door. I'll give you cover, Thorne yelled, throwing himself behind a console. There is nowhere to run, Detective, the chief stated, its brass head tilting. It raised a long, needle-like finger, not an extension of the uniform, but emerging from the stitched fabric itself. Your files are no longer pending. You are officially indexed. Your spatial acuity is excellent. As the chief advanced, the porcelain walls began to emit a high-pitched, resonant scream that felt like being squeezed from the inside. The light went fully crimson. The shift to crimson light was a physical assault. The sound wasn't just a scream. It was a frequency designed to shred nerves and disrupt the very coherence of thought. Thorne felt his vision swim, the blue porcelain walls seeming to melt and reform before his eyes. "Lena!" "The door!" Thorne yelled, forcing his shaking hands to level his pistol at the advancing chief. Lena, fighting the overwhelming auditory assault, sprinted toward the steel door. As her hand reached for the handle, the chief's crimson gaze locked onto her. Contaminant designated. Officer L. Hanson. Spatial acuity, moderate. Function, secondary anchor candidate. The chief didn't move fast, but its movements were utterly precise, divorced from friction or momentum. It raised its needle-like finger, and a thin beam of intense, pulsing crimson energy shot out, impacting the steel door handle just inches from Lena's grasp. The metal instantly glowed white-hot, then vaporized in a small cloud of toxic steam. Lena recoiled, shaking her burned fingertips. It sealed the exit. Thorne fired, emptying the rest of his magazine at the chief's brass head. The bullets struck the polished surface, leaving bright, momentary sparks, but doing no visible damage. They were simply absorbed, converted into more energy for the crimson light. It's feeding on the kinetics. Thorne realized, discarding the empty weapon. He fumbled for his backup knife, a heavy tactical blade, knowing it was likely futile. "We have to hit the anchors. The brains." He turned and threw himself at the control console, using the short distance to close in on the nearest suspended tank. Commander Holloway. Detective E. Thorne. Spatial acuity, exceptional. Primary anchor candidate, the chief announced, its voice perfectly calm over the electronic screaming. It moved toward Thorne with frightening speed. "Your inherent disbelief in the structure makes your data highly valuable for final integration." Thorne didn't hesitate. He plunged the heavy steel knife into the side of the Commander Holloway tank. The result was instantaneous and catastrophic. The blue fluid flashed dark purple. The brain inside convulsed, and the gold wires leading from it snapped like guitar strings. The lights across the entire control matrix exploded in a shower of blue and crimson sparks. The agonizing electronic shriek cut off, replaced by a massive, deafening thud that echoed up from the very foundations of the lighthouse. The chief froze mid-stride, its crimson light dimming to a faint ember within the brass slit. The circuit broke. Lena shouted over the ringing in their ears. "Holloway's system link is down." The chief remained motionless for a terrifying second. Then, the crimson light flared back, not as bright as before, but possessing a deeper, hungrier quality. "Anchor Holloway is purged. System integrity has dropped to 42%. A replacement must be secured immediately. Protocol dictates the highest available acuity must be indexed." The chief slowly turned its attention away from the disabled console and focused entirely on Thorne. The chief no longer looked like a patchwork uniform. It looked like a single, solid mass of dark, vibrating metal beneath the fabric. "You, Detective Thorne, you possess the greatest potential for fixed order," the chief stated. "You will stabilize the structure." Thorne felt a strange, magnetic pull toward the empty tank slot on the console, the one waiting for the new primary anchor. His feet felt heavy, wanting to obey the pull. "No, you don't," Lena cried. She saw Thorne's glazed look, the telltale sign of the Nexus's mental grip. With a surge of adrenaline, Lena grabbed the heavy, discarded metal coil, the one she used to hit the archivist, and without aiming, she hurled it across the room, not at the chief, but at the second control panel, the one dedicated to storing the missing person's data, currently inert after the archivist's defeat. The coil struck the console. It was a crude impact, but it was enough to dislodge the main power couplings. The lights in the room began to fail in sequence, blue, then red, plunging the room into intermittent darkness punctuated by Thorne's weak flashlight beam. The chief roared, a sound that finally seemed to possess genuine rage. "Contamination. You are introducing randomness." In that split second of failing power, the magnetic pull on Thorne vanished. He lunged for Lena, dragging her toward the dark, steaming hole they had climbed out of moments before. "It's losing control. The structure is failing," Thorne yelled, scrambling into the shaft. The whole damn thing is collapsing. As they dropped backward into the darkness, Thorne looked up one last time. The chief stood at the edge of the control platform, its crimson light flickering wildly. It raised both hands, and the porcelain walls began to crack. The Point Hope fix will be achieved. If the Matrix fails, the seed must be deployed. The chief shrieked, its voice degrading into static and agonizing, high-pitched feedback. They plummeted down the narrow shaft, falling through levels that were collapsing into one another. Blue light chambers buckling into yellow-lit archives, which twisted into the crushing blackness below. They were falling through a structure tearing itself apart, the sound of grinding impossible geometry closing in around them. They landed hard on the rough, familiar asphalt of the lighthouse path outside, the heavy thud jarring their bones back into reality. The air smelled clean, salty, and utterly normal. The Point Hope lighthouse stood before them, just as it should, old, white brick, illuminated by a single, operational beacon sweeping the dark sea. But as they looked back at where the black granite monstrosity had been, they saw something new. Sitting incongruously on the perfectly manicured grass, where the foundation of the impossible tower had been, was a single, small object pulsing with a faint, internal green light that IT was a briefcase, standard issue for the chief of police. And it looked like it had been waiting for them. The sudden return to the familiar reality of the coastline, the sound of the Real Ocean, the smell of pine and salt, was disorienting, a brutal sensory whiplash. Thorne coughed, spitting grit and tasting a faint, coppery bitterness that reminded him of the archivist's influence. They lay sprawled on the cold asphalt, illuminated only by the familiar, rhythmic sweep of the real lighthouse beam. Lena pushed herself up, wiping black grime from her face. "It's gone," she breathed, staring at the white brick exterior of the old watcher. "It just reset. Did we just get spit out?" Thorne slowly got to his feet, his muscles screaming in protest. He checked his side. His knife was gone, presumably assimilated or dropped in the collapsing structure. He patted his pockets. His badge was warped, the metal soft and pliable. "It didn't reset, Hanson," Thorne said, his voice gravelly. He stared at the briefcase sitting 20 feet away, utterly incongruous against the normal, damp grass. It pulsed with that faint, sickeningly familiar green light. It deployed. The briefcase was standard issue, heavy aluminum, reinforced locks, but the light emanating from the seams suggested a low-level internal power source, likely the last failing component of the operator Riley. The chief said if the Matrix failed, the seed must be deployed, Lena recalled, her eyes wide with dread as she slowly approached the case. What kind of seed? Thorne moved to stand beside her, feeling the residual mental fatigue of fighting the archivist's despair. "We don't know, but whatever was running that monstrosity is now contained in that case. We can't leave it here." They reached the briefcase. The green glow was fainter up close, barely visible in the sweep of the lighthouse beam. Thorne carefully examined the locks. They weren't simple tumbler locks. They were etched with the impossible geometry they had seen in the lower levels, the subtle, non-Euclidean cuts. The architect used logic gates based on impossible shapes to seal entry, Thorne observed. These locks won't be opened by conventional means. They'll need a countersignal or an override key. Lena, however, was staring at the faint scratches on the aluminum casing. "Detective, look closer. These scratches aren't random wear. They're tool marks." She pointed to 3 specific grooves near the latch. They were shallow, but distinct, and they aligned perfectly with the faint indentation marks on the handle of Thorne's own service weapon, the one he'd fired empty at the chief. "When you shot the chief," Lena reasoned, "the energy dissolved the bullets, but maybe the impact left a resonance signature on the case, a temporary key drawn from the nearest kinetic source." Thorne remembered the silver smudges on Riley's uniform. The system logged the kinetic data. It registered the weapon's signature when the chief was attacked. He pulled the ruined, warped pistol from his belt. The metal was still soft enough to bend slightly. He took the barrel and, with painstaking care, aligned it with the etched grooves on the briefcase. There was no explosive sound this time, just a soft, barely audible hiss of equalization. The green light inside the case died instantly. The magnetic pull was gone. Thorne cautiously flipped the latches. They clicked open with the satisfying, normal sound of well-oiled metal. He lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of finely shredded paper, paper that looked eerily like the missing persons reports they saw downstairs, was a single item. It wasn't a bomb, or a trigger, or a strange alien artifact. It was a small, pristine, leather-bound notebook. It looked old, water-stained, and thoroughly mundane. Engraved on the front, almost faded, was a single name, J. Marlowe. A diary? Lena looked utterly confused. After all that, the seed is just a diary? Thorne reached in and picked up the book. It felt cool, real, and terrifyingly ordinary. He flipped it open to the first page. It was dated 50 years ago. The handwriting was neat, disciplined. The entry read, November 7th, 1975. Log entry 001. The initial observations of the anomaly at the point are confirmed. The spatial discrepancies are not random. They are intentional. I have begun sketching the required parameters for a localized, self-sustaining anchor. The Council demands results. I call the theoretical construct the Lighthouse Project. The raw material must be absence. I require the first data set by the end of the month. Thorne flipped through the remaining pages. They were filled with complex, non-Euclidean mathematical formulae mixed with mundane personal notes about the local weather and fishing reports. He recognized the impossible geometry from the walls in the diagrams. This wasn't the architect, Thorne realized, his voice sinking to a horrified whisper. The architect was a tool. This Marlowe, he's the designer. He flipped to the final, last page, dated just this morning, November 7th, 2025. Log entry 18,265. The matrix is stable, the proxy is functioning, and the Nexus is routing optimally. The lighthouse is nearly complete. The final component required for permanent fixation is not data, but awareness. The initial test subjects must be those closest to the system, the ones who understand the rules. Thorne and Hanson, they have confirmed the structure's existence and survived the initial stages. They are now the final, perfect awareness required to believe in the lighthouse. The awareness of the police force, the last line of defense, is the final circuit. Below the text, there was a single, fresh stamp mark. It was the official seal of the Point Hope Police Department. Thorne looked up at Lena, his face gray. The chief wasn't trying to kill us to protect the blueprint. He was trying to kill us because we were the final key to locking the entire system into reality. Marlowe built the structure using the Lost, and now he needs us to validate it by reporting back to the station. He looked down the road leading back to town, the lights of Point Hope twinkling innocently under the normal sky. If we go back to the station, we report our findings to the real chief. Marlowe's contingency plan takes over. We close the loop, and Point Hope becomes a permanent, non-Euclidean geometry. Lena looked back at the white brick lighthouse, then at the innocuous, terrifying notebook in Thorne's hand. So what do we do, detective? We can't just leave this, and we can't go back. Thorne closed the notebook gently. The green glow from the briefcase was gone, but the presence of the seed remained. We have the architect's blueprints, Hanson. We know how the system was built. Now we have to find Marlowe, and we have to burn the foundation. He tucked the notebook into his jacket. We're not going back to town. We're going to the only place the architect drew energy from, the Ocean Woods. We are now reaching the halfway point of the story. Thorne secured the briefcase containing Marlowe's notebook in the trunk of their cruiser. They left Riley's body untouched near the lighthouse, explaining that would be a headache for a department that now likely consisted only of the chief. We head into the Ocean Woods, Thorne stated, gripping the steering wheel. The woods are where the absence originates. If Marlowe anchored his whole operation in the missing people, the core power source has to be somewhere deep inside. Lena, who now wore the grim determination of a seasoned veteran, nodded. Sector Gamma. That's where Lauren Jenkins vanished. The archivist mentioned it as high-value data. Driving away from the coast felt like fleeing a collapsing dimension. As they entered the federally protected boundary of the Ocean Woods, the atmosphere immediately shifted again. The air grew dense, muffling the sound of the engine. The towering pine trees seemed to lean in, their shadows solidifying into palpable obstacles. The GPS is dead again, Lena confirmed, pointing to the blank screen. But the compass, look. The compass needle on the dashboard was spinning wildly, refusing to settle on a fixed north. It was jittering between erratic spins and settling on strange, unmapped headings. Thorne pulled out Marlowe's notebook. The final entry, the one about them being the final circuit, seemed to burn under his gaze. He flipped to the older maps. Marlowe had sketched crude topographical charts overlaid with geometric grids. Marlowe wasn't just documenting the disappearances. He was mapping the negative space. Thorne analyzed, tracing a line across a diagram labeled core sink, gamma point. He marked areas of extreme spatial distortion with this symbol. He showed Lena the symbol, a circle with a line crossing it, but the line was curved, not straight. The non-Euclidean shapes destabilize conventional navigation. Lena translated, her mind sharp despite the exhaustion. If we follow the path of greatest distortion, we should find the strongest point of the structure's energy draw, the core sink. They ditched the cruiser where the trees grew too thick for the vehicle to pass. Stepping into the woods was like entering a place where the light refused to penetrate. It wasn't just dark, it was a negation of light. They hiked for nearly an hour, guided only by the intermittent, jerky readings on the compass and Thorne's interpretation of Marlowe's mad cartography. The forest was unnervingly quiet. No crickets, no wind, no rustle of unseen animals. Just the crunch of their boots on the mossy, damp ground. Then, the ground under Thorne's left foot felt subtly wrong. It gave slightly, not sinking, but shifting, a subtle, lateral displacement. He slammed his knife hand against a nearby pine trunk. "Stop," he hissed. He pointed his weak flashlight beam at the ground where he'd stepped. There was nothing visible, but when he tapped the moss with his boot heel again, the ground rippled like shallow water. "We're walking on a skin layer," Lena realized, her voice tight. "The core sink isn't a structure, it's a mass. It's covering something." They started testing the ground ahead of them with long branches, tapping methodically. They found small, localized patches where the forest floor was too soft, areas that felt hollow underneath, areas that seemed to absorb sound. Finally, they reached a clearing that was not a clearing at all. It was a massive, perfect circle carved into the woods, a vast depression about 50 yards wide, where the trees had clearly been pushed away, not cut down to eye in the center of the depression, illuminated by the diffuse, sickly light filtering through the dense canopy, was an object that made the lighthouse look like a child's toy.it was enormous, low to the ground, and completely organic. It looked like a gigantic, pulsating mass of pale, fungal tissue, laced with thick, obsidian-black veins that pulsed faintly with a returning green light, the residual power of the operator Riley. The fungal mass had a wet, rhythmic sloshing sound emanating from its core. Embedded into the slick surface of the mass, like flies caught in amber, were dozens of objects. Old boots, rusted fishing hooks, a child's bicycle wheel, and, most chillingly, the recognizable, skeletal outline of a full human torso, partially enveloped by the pulsing growth. "The core sink," Thorne breathed. "It's not an energy source. It's a compost heap." Marlowe wasn't just using the absence of the missing. He was consuming the physical remains to fuel the structure's expansion. As they stood there, transfixed by the silent, biological horror, a new sound rose from the pulsating mass. It was a slow, deep grinding, as if vast, subterranean gears were turning beneath the moss. From the very center of the fungal mound, where the green light was strongest, something began to emerge. It wasn't elegant like the chief or mechanical like the archivist. It was simply big, slow, and covered in the same slick, black-veined membrane as the mass itself. It rose on two thick, stubby limbs, its form vaguely humanoid but utterly alien, its head smooth, featureless, and reflecting the faint light like wet stone. The seed had sprouted. The creature rising from the fungal mass was the antithesis of the precise, geometric horror they had witnessed in the lighthouse. If the lighthouse was a calculated, artificial nightmare, this thing was raw, biological inevitability, a corruption of nature itself, fueled by the collected remains of the lost. It rose slowly, deliberately, its stubby limbs flexing with wet suction sounds. Its skin, a slick, reflective black, mirrored the canopy above, making it difficult to focus on its shape. It was massive, easily 10 feet tall, and its silent ascent seemed to absorb all available sound. That's it. Thorne gasped, backing up slowly, dragging Lena with him. That's the real power source. The physical anchor for Marlowe's geometry. The creature, the seed, did not speak. It didn't need Nexus or an archivist. It communicated through a deep, visceral vibration that resonated directly in Thorne's skull, bypassing his ears entirely. It was a feeling of utter, complete ownership. You have exceeded parameters. You have located the nexus of resource extraction. The validation sequence requires immediate termination of all external variables. The vibration was so powerful that Thorne's vision blurred, and he doubled over, clutching his temples. Lena, perhaps shielded by her recent error state status, fared slightly better. She recognized the lack of conventional sound. It's using resonance, detective, not voice. Try to disrupt the frequency. Thorne struggled to regain his footing, his mind screaming against the forced intrusion. He remembered the only thing that had worked against the structure's logic: unpredictability and physical disruption. The rifle shots against the chief were useless, but the physical impact on the consoles and the wire had caused systemic shock. The notebook. Thorne choked out, pointing back toward the direction of the coast where the cruiser was parked. Marlowe's file is the final key. We burned the original blueprint. The seed took a heavy, dragging step forward, causing the ground beneath it to liquefy and bubble with that horrible green remnant energy. It was slow, but utterly unstoppable. I'll draw its attention, Lena yelled, a reckless light in her eyes. She pulled the only piece of equipment she still held, a spare flare gun, and fired a brilliant, shrieking red flare directly at the creature's blank face. The flare struck the featureless surface and burst in a shower of blinding, chemical fire. The seed recoiled slightly, not from pain, but from the sudden, violent change in local energy signature. The resonating frequency in Thorne's head fractured into a painful screech. Go, Hanson. I'll follow. Thorne pushed her toward the denser tree line. Lena didn't argue. She sprinted, dodging behind the thick trunks. Thorne didn't run. He snatched Marlowe's notebook from his jacket. The pages felt warm, almost feverish, responding to the proximity of the seed. He flipped frantically toward the end. The seed focused entirely on Thorne now, its primary threat. It lowered its massive bulk, preparing to crush him. Thorne found the final page, the one describing the awareness requirement. He ripped the page out. The paper resisted, clinging to the binding with surprising tensile strength, but he tore it free. As he held the final page, the air around him shimmered. He wasn't just holding paper. He was holding the idea that validated the entire structure. He stared at the seed, its massive, blank face closing in. You need awareness to validate the structure, Marlowe? Well, here's your validation. With a final, desperate cry of defiance, Thorne struck a match on the granite curbstone where they had left the cruiser earlier and set the final page of the notebook on fire. The flame was small, mundane, but the reaction was galactic. The moment the paper, the final instruction, caught fire, the vibration stopped instantly. The seed stopped moving. It didn't explode or collapse. It simply froze, its grotesque form locked mid-lunge, its slick skin immediately beginning to dull, turning to a brittle, matte black. The ashen woods around them sighed. It was the first natural sound they had heard in hours, the sound of trees settling, the sound of the weight being lifted. Thorne stood panting, watching the final page burn down to ash in his hand. Lena emerged from the trees, her face streaked with tears and soot. Detective? Thorne. It's over, Hanson. Thorne managed, watching the giant, frozen husk of the seed begin to crumble, turning into fine, odorless dust that the first whisper of a breeze carried away. Marlowe ran out of instruction. They stood there for a long time, listening to the forest return to normal. The chirp of a cricket, the faint, distant sound of the real ocean surf, the predictable sweep of the real lighthouse beam. The horror of the geometry was gone, replaced by the mundane horror of what they now knew lay beneath the moss of Point Hope. They walked back to the cruiser. The briefcase was now just an empty aluminum box. The compass needle settled firmly on north. They drove out of the woods and back onto the coastal highway. The silence in the car was different now. It was the silence of two people who had seen behind the curtain of reality and somehow managed to crawl back out. The station, Lena said finally, her voice weary. What do we tell them? What do we put in the report? Thorne glanced at the empty space where the chief of police's briefcase had been. He looked at the notebook's charred remains in his hand. We tell them, Thorne said, pulling onto the highway toward the sunrise, that Officer Riley and Officer Hanson were dispatched to an unusually quiet location, investigated a structural anomaly, and found nothing. We tell them the night was long, and we need a new shift rotation. He looked at Lena, and for the first time in days, he saw a flicker of the eager rookie she was, mixed with the iron-willed survivor she had become. And we tell them we're filing a formal request to have the entire Ocean Woods permanently cordoned off for unspecified environmental hazards. He kept the charred remnants of the notebook. The anchor was gone, but the awareness, the knowledge of how to build a horror out of absence, was now in his head. And he knew, with chilling certainty, that someone, somewhere, might try to build another lighthouse. The sunrise over Point Hope was brutally beautiful, washing the familiar, white brick lighthouse in shades of gold and pink that seemed almost insulting in their normalcy. Thorne and Lena drove in silence, the town slowly waking up to the sound of lobster boats heading out, the sound of a reality stubbornly refusing to acknowledge the impossible night. They pulled up to the precinct. The chief's empty office sat just inside the entrance, the door slightly ajar. The chief, of course, was gone, reclaimed by the structural collapse, or perhaps simply having dissolved when the Nexus lost its primary directive. Thorne and Lena walked into the main dispatch room. Martha, the old dispatcher, was back at her station, sipping lukewarm coffee and coughing into her hand. "Morning, you two," she rasped, looking up. "Finally done with that paper drill? Thought you were out on a noise complaint. Long night for a Tuesday." Lena stepped forward, planting her hands on the counter. Her voice was steady, almost too steady. "False alarm, Martha. Just a structure fire near the coast. Electrical fault. We cleared the scene. Everything is nominal." Thorne watched Martha. She saw the exhaustion, the soot, the grime, but she saw no void, no chief, no grotesque seed. To her, it was a routine structural fire caused by faulty wiring. The Nexus had been overwritten, the matrix purged, and the local perception snapped back to the acceptable fiction. Thorne walked to his desk, his movements stiff. He placed the empty, warped aluminum briefcase on his blotter. He pulled out the charred remnants of Marlowe's final page. He looked at the soot and the unrecognizable carbon. "What about Riley?" Martha asked, her voice softening with genuine concern. "He's still listed as on patrol. Any word from him?" Thorne met Lena's eyes. They shared the silent pact. The truth was too dangerous. The truth was the seed. "Riley's shift was ended early, Martha," Thorne said, his voice hollow. "He had a sudden medical emergency related to the heat stress. He's been reassigned to administrative duty, off-site, until we can verify his stability." A lie, designed to cover the fact that his operator link had been destroyed, that he sat down and stared at the blank forms waiting for his signature. He had to write the report, and the report had to be normal. He picked up a clean sheet of paper, the heavy, watermarked bond of the Point Hope PD. He dipped his pen in ink. Incident report, November 7th, 2025. Reporting officers, Thorne, E. Detective, Hanson, L. Officer. Nature of call, report of unusual activity near 713 Whisper Road. Action taken. Upon arrival, no unusual activity was observed. An old, defunct communications unit was found to have suffered an internal electrical short, causing minor heat damage to the exterior. Conclusion, false alarm. All personnel accounted for except for Officer Riley, placed on temporary leave that he signed his name, Elias Thorne. But as the ink dried, a strange sensation washed over him. He had written the report, confirming the normal reality. By doing so, he had finalized the system override. He had become the ultimate validator for Marlowe's original plan, not by being anchored in the Matrix, but by rejecting the truth and enforcing the lie of stability. He looked down at his hand. The small scratches left by the archivist's crystalline needles were still there, tiny pinpricks on his forearm. As he lifted his other hand to smooth his hair, he noticed it. On the inside of his wrist, beneath the skin, he could just make out a faint, geometric pattern tracing itself slowly across his veins. It was the curve of the non-Euclidean triangle, subtle, almost invisible under his pale skin, that he hadn't destroyed the awareness. He had simply replaced the chief. He hadn't purged the seed. He had become the carrier. He had replaced the data points with the memory of the system itself. Thorne looked at Lena, who was staring blankly at a map of the ocean routes. He could see it in her eyes too, a new, unnerving clarity, a depth of understanding that wasn't human. She was processing data faster now, seeing the currents of the sea not as water, but as vectors. The Nexus was gone, the chief was gone, but the logic of the architect remained, embedded in the minds of the two officers who survived the night. Thorne put the report in the outbox for the now-absent chief. He looked out the window at the unchanging town. "Hanson," he said, his voice calm, professional, and chillingly empty. "We need to review the files on every disappearance in the last 50 years. We need to know exactly what data we missed." Lena turned, a faint, strange smile touching her lips. "Yes, Detective Thorne. We need to ensure there are no further absences in the jurisdiction." The silence in the precinct was now the silence of perfect, bureaucratic consensus. The lighthouse project was complete. Point Hope was fixed.